Hello, and welcome to Rational Pilot's ongoing series on better forecasting. My name is Matt Johnson, and welcome to our session. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about Netflix's earnings this week. They had some issues because they had promised about 6.2 million customers, new customers in Q2, and they came in at about 5 million. Looking at some of the news, one thing that jumped out at us was the reasoning for that, and they blamed their own forecasting models for the miss. So one of the things that triggered us to create this session was to take a look and see whether or not something could have been seen in advance to see if there was indeed a flawed forecast based on prior trends and whether you could use that sort of methodology in your own business. So, like our previous sessions where we focused in on Tesla's manufacturing data, we're going to look at Netflix's data, but we're not necessarily making a comment about Netflix per se. We're simply showing you how to use this in your own business and looking at a real world example and how that might play out. So with that said, let's get started. So what we're going to do here is we use the Netflix financial statements. If you go to them, you can download them in Excel format, um, and you can see the total number of subscribers and their segment information. They break it out by domestic and international. So we've used this data, um, so what we'll do is we'll create a project from this in the Rational Pilot system. We'll start from the beginning here. So we'll create a project called Netflix subscribers. We'll just call it Netflix subs. And we're using quarters here. We're going to just call it number of subs. And we'll choose a file. Now, what I did was I actually created a simpler file than taking the data from Netflix verbatim, that allows me to kind of simplify what I'm showing here. They had a lot more data than just the subscribers, so I've trimmed it to just include the subscribers. So we'll bring that into our project here, and we'll quickly notice a couple of things. Number one is we've added the amber dot is the forecast for Q2. Now that's a statement that Netflix puts out every quarter about the upcoming quarter in terms of what to expect. And one of the few public companies that actually do that, and kudos for them for doing it. So you can also see international versus domestic in this. You can obviously see that international is growing at a much faster rate than domestic, and then you can see how that influences the overall total line. What we're going to be focusing on today is that total. So if we set this up, and we'll go ahead and include the point on forecast that will indicate the point that they indicated. Now, this has actuals in it as well, so you can see that blue line kind of coming up underneath the bottom of the forecast. One might say, if you were looking at this, say, back in March instead of in June, you might say, hey, it looks pretty good, looks pretty achievable. We're going to show a little bit about how you can use the Rational Pilot tool to get a little bit more microscopic into the view here. So the first thing we ought to do is we ought to put our ensemble on. Our ensemble regression is a combination of numerous regressions. We've talked about this in prior sessions. It's like a hurricane forecast where you have multiple tracks that get accumulated into an aggregate view. So the RP ensemble is a good way to get a range of potential outcomes. And another thing that we have as a tool is the ability to turn the time dial back in time and take a look at what trends might have been starting from a certain point backwards in time, as opposed to just looking at current to future. So we're going to take a look back at when this expectation was set, when the earnings came out in March. So we'll just put this in here, March 31st, 2018. The way you do that with our tool is you click math only. That allows the chart to stay the way it is, but allows your math to start calculating at an arbitrary date. If you don't click math only, what it's going to do is it's going to trim the chart that's visible. So let's just do math only, and you can kind of see, hey, again, it's looking like things are pretty much on the nose. What could possibly be the problem? So here's where we're going to show you an additional feature that will allow you to kind of get under the hood, so to speak, and see a little bit more. So let's take a look. We'll do the download chart function, and that'll take the data that we have visible right here on this chart and put it into an Excel. So we'll pull that up real quick. And you can see all the data points that we had visible in the chart displayed in an Excel format. So you have the total, which is the total number of subscribers coming across. You have the forecast, which came from Netflix at 131, 195, and then you have what we call the ensemble average. The ensemble average is, in our view, the most reliable indicator out of the ensemble package for if you want to pick a point to base your forecast off of. Sure, you can go and you can say I'm going to take the high, I'm going to be more conservative and take the low. But if you take the average, that's what we recommend to do. The high and the low serve as kind of guardrails to give you a range of expectations. So rather than saying just I'm going to forecast the average, you can give yourself a sense of range. We also use this as an indicator of timing risk. As we talked about in the two sessions prior to this, where we focused in on Tesla, you can use the ensemble high and the low to give you a sense for a timing slip that might be occurring or might happen in your future operations. So today we're going to look at just the ensemble average, and we're going to look at this gap. So they came in at 131.41. Our ensemble average said 137.78, and they came in at 131.195. So you can see right off the bat, if they had gone with the ensemble average, they probably would have had a slightly different outcome. Still would have missed, but it would have been a much more narrow miss. Now, that's not to say that Netflix's models are any worse than ours. Models are models. Nobody can predict the future. But I would say this, unless you think you're better than Netflix and that you have better models, you're probably best off using the best tools that you have available, because as their example shows, everybody can miss a forecast. There's no predicting the future, but you can give yourself a sense of insurance or a sense of assurance that that you're guiding your business in the right direction if you use a tool. We happen to prefer the tools in Rational Pilot, but if you have a tool that you believe works for you, that's a lot better than just looking at it and saying that looks reasonable, or I think we can do that. Use a tool to give you an objective approach. And we are simply saying the Rational Pilot ensemble average is a pretty darn good tool, as evidenced by this. Now let's take a look at what they could have seen if they had gone back and looked at a couple of other tools that we have in the bag on Rational Pilot. So we'll come back here very quickly. We'll reset our screen here and get rid of all of the ensemble and the forecast. Let's take a look at a set of tools that we call momentum. So when you're looking at momentum, it's kind of like a speedometer. You're looking at the incremental, the marginal activity of your business. And so we offer two different ways of looking at the incremental aspects of your business. One is using a linear regression, and the other is using an internal regression that uses the data that as it moves and changes to give you a little bit more variability than a linear would give you. And remember, a linear is just going to draw a straight line through your data. It's not necessarily going to react or be as responsive and dynamic to the changes in your trends. It's going to give you a generalized trend, whereas the internal is going to be a little bit more adaptive to the changes in your trends. So one of the things we can do here, and this is very helpful in creating benchmarks for your company, so that you understand how you're performing at a certain point in time relative to your historical performance. So if we take a look at the internal momentum charts, we'll just take a look at that and we'll see how the chart changes. So again, what you're looking at here is the blue line represents your long-term benchmark. This is your historical rate of growth. And you can see in Netflix's case, it's very stable. You can also see in the green line, this is the most recent trend. So the way we do our momentum statistics is we give you both the long-term trend, but then the more recent, say, moving trend as a comparison point. So as you can see, when you start looking at this data, things are moving pretty closely to the historical. And then there was this dip in Q3, followed by a peak at the end of Q1. And so if you're a forecaster and you're looking at this data, you can say, well, okay, we've had some recent variability looking at this dip followed by this peak, but we've got this very stable long-term average. Which is going to be the better predictor of future performance? Um, is it going to be the one that where you've got some recent variability, both to the upside and the downside, kind of contradicting each other, or is it going to be the long-term average? And that's where we would recommend you look at the data, you use this kind of tool, and you make that decision for yourself. In the case of Netflix, had they taken the longer-term average, they would have probably not had the investor reaction that they did when they announced earnings. The other thing we can show you just by way of comparison, and this is actually a really good tool. A lot of people make the mistake of using linear regressions in isolation and not using other techniques. We always favor using multiple techniques to kind of get at the function of your business rather than just relying on one. And I'm going to show you real quickly here how using the linear, it could have led Netflix, or I'm not saying they did use linear, I have no idea how their forecast models are structured, but if you were to rely on linear in your own business, how that might have misled you if you were in the same position as Netflix. So let's just take a look at the story that the linear tells you. So linear is telling you essentially that you have this upward trajectory of growth. Things are going good, but you're not seeing that same story out of the linear math as you are the internal math. And that's for good reason, because the linear is more of a generalized trend. So if you rely on that only, what you would have been saying to yourself and potentially to your board, to your investors, to your team is, hey, we're going to see, north of 6 million subscribers for Q2, and obviously that didn't happen. So it's important not to rely on these trends. One other thing that I wanted to show you guys real quick before wrapping up this session, if you go back and you take a look at the data that we were to be able to pull out using the math only technique and going back in time and looking at how the forecast would have played out. We went ahead and did this for a number of the data points and going back several quarters. And so here's what we ended up with is, so we've got the average for June would have been 130, so we would have been off by about a half a percentage point. Q1, obviously, if you go back and you look at the internal momentum, that was a pretty nice rise against or peak against the historic benchmark. We were off on that one for about 2.5%. Again, Q1 or Q4 of 2017, we're a little bit off on that. And then the others, what they kind of speak for themselves. So this doesn't necessarily mean that the RP ensemble average is going to work like this in all of the cases. What it means, though, is that Netflix happens to have a very stable trend. They happen to have a very stable upward trend. That speaks well for their long-term value proposition for their investors. But they happen to have a pretty stable trend, and it's fitting well with our math. And we're also looking at it with the ensemble, which is a combination of a number of regressions together. And so that's producing a very highly accurate result. There's been a number of studies, and I won't get too far into this. We'll do this in another session down the road with my co-founder, Eric. But there's been a number of studies about forecasting techniques. And what has come to kind of the general consensus view is that the simpler regressions tend to handle more cases more effectively than the more complex regressions. We've certainly put in all of the regressions that we feel represent the most likely cases that you're going to encounter. But there could be some on the edge that we haven't incorporated in the product. If there are some that you'd like to see, direct message me, get in touch with me, we'll add them into the product. But what we wanted to start with as a basis were a focus on using a tool, using benchmarks, helping companies get beyond just staring at charts and saying it looks reasonable. That's not going to work in today's age, and we feel that a measured and objective benchmark is the way to go. Now let's take a look. Let's say you wanted to share this data with your fellow coworkers and do it inside the system and stay outside of mail. So we created within our discussion tabs, and this will be the last thing that we talk about, and then we'll close with this, that you can actually upload files from outside of the system into the system, kind of similar to a file sharing capability. So we'll just put this in here. So we'll put Netflix trends. We'll pick this file, and then we'll upload it. And now it's available for you to download it. You can see, you know, a number of things, you know, stats about it. And then that way, when you're creating a discussion and a collaboration standpoint, you can add additional data points into your analysis that come from outside of the system and share them with other users to see. So, you know, in fact, you can even add that, wrap that around your comments. You can say, hey, I uploaded, if I can type correctly, I uploaded a chart of RP ensemble outputs for prior 4 quarters for Netflix. Check the files tab. And then you can add that in as a comment. So just another way, another set of functionality that other people can use as you're building your view of your company's forecast. And with that, I'm going to close. Thank you for listening. And we'll come back in the next couple of sessions and talk a little bit more technically about what it is that our math is doing and how it works for a lot of situations that we've, certainly the ones we've been illustrating up until this point, but as well some that may be very interesting for you and your business. So with that, thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next session.